Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack. Back again to bring you our 10.05 Disc Priest Advanced Ramp Guide. Everything you need to know about handling the mess of Disc Priest in a raid in Dragonflight. With this, we're going to start talking about some of the changes that Discipline has received, airing the spec more towards Shadow Covenant and a lot of the Shadow spell-oriented gameplay, talking about how the talents work, how the spec is going to be operating in the raid, and how best to sequence your damage, which has a few different ways that I've seen some of the top logs doing it. And finally, going over some resources that you can utilize to be able to prepare for every incoming fight in Vault of the Incarnates before you get there. With that, let's start talking first and foremost about the talents. Disc is, of course, your ramping burst raid healer, and while it's not as insane as Evoker's combo effects and combo ramp effects that they have going on, you're still able to put together a monumental amount of output if you're properly planning things out. With this build, and you can find the talent string in the description down below, this is going to be focusing on a couple different aspects. They've changed around your Vampiric Embrace so it's off the GCD, which means you could utilize it in conjunction with Shadow Covenant or with mini ramps if needed, or you can also take Sanguine Teachings to be able to have Leech on hand. I don't have any Leech on my gear, and I have Avoidance Enchants, so I'm opting for the Leech from the talents, but Vamp Embrace can also be good. Halo is wonderful for every raid fight, except for maybe Kurog, because Divine Star is just absolutely insane. You don't really need Mind Games because of the 10.05 changes, where you have double charge of Mind Blast and really reduced mana cost, sort of outshines that other resource. Angelic Bulwark, I often find, is pretty poor, so I often opt not to take it, instead looing for Light's Inspiration and cooldown reduction for my Fade, so I could be activating it constantly for some of the more consistent damage encounters that you have outside in Vault of the Incarnates. With that said, there's a lot of good options now in the spec tree, and there's a lot of different competition, a lot of different points that are vying for attention. Solace is now going to be interacting with a host of your abilities, one of which being Wheel and Woe, be able to provide a substantial damage buff to your power with Solace. You also are able to use Solace Cast to give you Harsh Discipline stacks to be able to get more Bolts of Penance. And Shadow Covenant talents have been changed. Twilight Corruption now is giving you a buff to your Shadow Covenant rather than turning Penance dark. Shadow Covenant just magically turns Penance into a dark spell on its own, as well as Halo. So many are opting for the increased damage that you're getting out of Shadow Covenant, as opposed to the longer duration of Shadow Covenant, because most of Disc's output is in like a 6 or 8 second window. It's in a very narrow window of time that you want to do all of your damage to be able to produce the most healing possible. Expiation is extremely strong, increasing the damage of your Mind Blast and Shadow or Death, also consuming some Purge the Wicked uptime in order to deal upfront damage. And this is making it so that you can deal even more damage in a narrow window of time. While expensive, you are going to be able to have Painful Punishment on hand, so that those extra penance bolts are going to give you more extension to your Purge the Wicked, which can make a very large difference. Light's Wrath is wonderful, it's insane, it's great, it's lovely, and of course Indemnity is giving you some extra atonement uptime out of your resources. Evangelism, backbone of the spec. It and Rapture are going to be used very frequently together in this raid. There's a couple fights where you could maybe break them up if you choose, but for the most part, you pretty much utilize them together with their 1.5 minute timers to also use with Light's Wrath to sort of have one mechanic that you're just going to cover entirely that nobody else really needs to worry about. With that being said, I wanted to dig into the logs because there's been a few different ways that Disc Priests have been operating since the 10.05 changes, and I wanted to highlight both of them to be able to demonstrate how there's different ways to be able to produce your damage, but there's very, very important elements that remain the same. When you are applying your atonements, when you're extending the duration, and when you start doing damage are always of paramount importance more than anything else out there for Disc Priests right now. There's been a few different ways that players are producing their damage and how they're weaving between their spells to maximize their output, but the basis of using their Evangelism, using their Rapture at about the same times always remains the same, and we'll talk about that a little bit more when we get to the resources section. For now, I wanted to talk about how the different builds that are going out for dealing damage, and how you're able to look at logs and how you're able to analyze them yourself as you prepare for an encounter. There's a few different important things that you'll usually look at whenever you pull up a log of a player. This one's, for example, on Broodkeeper Diurna. You can start seeing the ebbs and flows of atonement for when healing is being produced. You can also pull up their page, see what talent builds they're running with, export them, copy them yourself to see if there's specific talent differences per different encounters. That stuff's all great. What happens as you go forward, though, is when you want to see specifically when players use their abilities, this is where you can click on the player's name, go to the cast section here, and then click on timelines to be able to specifically break down at which point in time of the encounter they're using specific abilities. So when it comes to something like evangelism, this is how you're able to look at the entire sequence of events of how players are using their abilities and what they're doing about it. For example, the most standard way, really, to apply atonement for an evangelism ramp is starting with Rapture. You'll Rapture, and as you can see, the player already has power infusions. They have plenty of haste to be able to apply 10 atonements while Rapture is up. Since they did buff Renew and they did buff Flash Heal damage, often you will apply your final atonement, the Flash Heal, especially if you have a Surge of Light proc. It's very convenient because Binding Heals talent will also apply atonement to yourself. Once you apply those 10 single target atonements to players, you'll then follow it up with double Radiance casts. A lot of players will break up these two casts with a Purge the Wicked, for example, because this allows you to sort of get an extra global to decide your next target and make your life a lot easier. You'll then extend your duration with Evangelism. This is pretty standard across the board from everybody playing Disc at a high level right now. It's just about always going to be the same. What's different is how players are dealing damage. There's two primary ways that I've seen it happen. On this encounter, it's Kurog, so people are using Divine Star, but other encounters, people would use Halo. Starting with that, followed by Schism, Light's Wrath, Shadow Covenant, which turns your penance into Dark Reprimand, and then you're ignoring Twilight Equilibrium sort of temporarily, because a lot of your damage and your atonement resources are coming from Light's Wrath, Dark Penance, and Mind Blast, which is also consuming Purge the Wicked damage to create Expiation. So in this window of time, you're not fully realizing Twilight Equilibrium to get more burst output at a necessary moment. Then you're going back to Twilight Equilibrium with a Power Word Solace cast, which is buffed by Wheel and Woe, another Mind Blast cast, and queuing up a Purge the Wicked. Whenever you cast Mind Blast and immediately queue up Purge the Wicked, it will immediately consume part of the 20 seconds of Purge the Wicked uptime that you're about to apply. This means that even if you don't have Purge the Wicked on a target, you can still yield expiation value by casting Mind Blast and hitting Purge the Wicked immediately as Mind Blast lands. I sort of just begin the cast and start mashing the Purge the Wicked button, and then it's going to instantly cast the Purge, consume 6 seconds of uptime, and deal expiation damage up front. This is one of the damage builds that I've seen going on, and there's a couple players who are doing something similar when it comes to Halo first. Once again, Schism, Light's Wrath, Shadow Covenant, Penance, Mind Blast into Purge, or Mind Blast into Solace. That has been one of the builds that I've been seeing. I've also been seeing another in which players are also going to be utilizing Schism first after their Evangelism into Light's Wrath, then Shadow Covenant, followed by Penance and Dark Reprimand, or even here, Shadow Covenant into Dark Halo, into Mind Blast, Solace, and so on. There's been a few different variations that happen, and part of it is also going to be based off of some of the damage that happens in the raid itself. And so the reason that some players might be holding Dark Penance, for example, is if they're a little bit early on a ramp, and they need to be able to sort of like buy a little bit of time, they'll weave through a couple of less important abilities. For example, sort of like front-loading Mind Blast so that they can have their penance later. Or if they don't have Harsh Discipline uptime already queued up in advance, then they'll cast those Mind Blasts earlier in the Mind Blast and Solace so they can get the Harsh Discipline that they have on hand. Ideally, you're going to be putting together your Rapture ramp, your Rapture application, already have Purge the Wicked uptime set on the target, already have your Harsh Discipline set on the target, and then you're going to be able to follow this sequence once again. There is a lot of different mechanics that you have to be able to juggle between as you're doing this, and that's why you're going to start seeing some of those differences that are coming into fruition. Personally, I really like being able to have the Dark Halo healing, and I personally enjoy being able to go into Schism, Light's Wrath, Shadow Covenant, Dark Halo, into Penance, Mind Blast, Solace, Mind Blast, Purge the Wicked, something like that, because it is going to be producing a lot of that raid-wide output. But what you're seeing in general is that as long as you're getting those timings correct, that's going to be able to have the largest impact overall when it comes to your healing. A lot of these encounters are really bursty in nature, and so as a result, Disc is able to benefit really heavily from having huge amounts of excess mana, one of which is going to be the Chilled Clarity Potion, which is allowing your instant global casts to be free and not sort of slow you down at all. But if you ever casted a spell like Powered Radiance, then the cast would be 40% longer. There were some changes to it where it was supposed to actually delay your GCDs, but they've since reversed that, so you can freely use the Chilled Clarity Mana Potion to be able to apply your atonements in advance. I usually use like a rank 2 of the potion, because I don't need the full 15-16 second duration. And so what I can do is I can Rapture, hit that Chilled Clarity Potion, and then cast all my atonements, and then it runs out before my Radiance casts begin. That's going to be a huge amount of the mana expenditure that you have in a raid, and so it's very important to be able to take advantage of that whenever you can. You're also able to benefit heavily, of course, from your Innervates, and so a lot of people are calling for those Innervates after a cast or two of their Rapture, so they're also able to capture the Powered Radiance mana expenditure that they have going on as they're trying to finalize their Atonement application before they get the extension. A lot of your damage abilities don't cost much mana, and so the brunt of the mana cost and reasons why players could go is because they're over-applying Atonements. When it comes to downtime, you have a lot of Powered Radiance casts available to you, and since Radiance does so much healing, it's also a good resource to be able to focus on just as the damage is beginning. Whereas when you have a Rapture ramp put together, and a Rapture and Evangelism ramp being used together, you want to be really far in advance to let all of your damage do the brunt of the output. And so whenever it comes to fights like maybe Dathia, there are times where I sort of desynced my ramp by going upstairs, or Kurog has a lot of bursty damage that sort of ramps up as you get deeper into the phase. I'll use my extra Radiance charges there to be able to cast them as the damage is happening to benefit from that Radiance output. You can be very aggressive with those resources, and we're going to get to some of the timing in advance so that you can know, hey, at this point in time is when I have to stop using those Radiance charges, but in general, you're going to use your double Radiance. Make sure you have Harsh Discipline stacked, make sure you have Purge the Wicked already stacked, following up with your Schism, and you can then use Shadow Covenant if your mana's in a healthy position to be able to go into Dark Penance, Mind Blast cast, Dark Halo cast from there. If your mana is not as healthy, you could just focus on Twilight Equilibrium Weaving, using Schism, using Penance since it's going to be a light spell, then using Mind Blast, Halo, Mind Blast, Solace as needed. There we go. There's a lot of different spells that the spec has to juggle at this point, but it's going to be so much about making sure that your timings and your resources are going to be exactly where you need them, when you need them. To this end, I wanted to highlight a website called lorgs.io, and it'll be linked in the description down below as well. This is a wonderful website to allow you to focus on preparation. When I mentioned that there's a bunch of different ways that Disc Priests have been dealing their damage, that is true. But there's also a lot of uniformity of when they're applying all of their atonements. And so while it's really overwhelming to have all this information about all the different damage abilities that you're juggling between, check out the written guides in the description below if you'd like to have the full text to be able to read from. But also, make sure you check out this lorgs.io, because the whole basis of it is it goes through the top 50 logs, the top 50 parses in the world on Warcraft logs, and then it allows you to sort all of the resources and abilities for when players are receiving their Innervates, when they're casting Power Infusion, but most importantly, when they're using Evangelism, Rapture, and of course, their Radiance charges. To focus on Radiances for just a moment, like I mentioned, there's a whole bunch of stuff on the screen right now. I got you. When you're taking it away, it allows you to isolate specific abilities for when a ramps are happening, each time that they're happening. And this helps you plan in advance for when you want to be able to produce your healing. Because on a fight like Broodkeeper Diurna, of course, you're running all over the room, you're stretching all over the room very consistently, and you're not always hitting a 1.5-minute timers. And so sometimes you can use your Rapture timer, your Rapture cooldown, and just instantly use it when it's up. Encounters like Broodkeeper, you're going to have to hold on to it a little bit, and this is where you're able to see firsthand what abilities are being ramped for with consistency. Since Evangelism is happening right at the end of your Atonement application, you can recognize that Rapture in advance is always being utilized alongside of it, except for a couple logs where there's some outliers, obviously. But you're able to start looking at, okay, that's the mechanic, or sorry, that's the ability that they're using, and then I'm able to click up here at the top for the abilities and find out, oh, every great staff, every 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 great staffs, there's an evangelism going off. And then you're able to consistently look at that and look at those timers when you're in the fight, and then start comparing them to your cooldowns as you're working on the boss fight and as you're progressing throughout the encounter. You can also make a notepad file. You can make a personal angry assignment note to be able to help you with the reminders. Of course, spreadsheet cooldowns. These are always good ways to be able to do it, and it's a good way to do your homework through these encounters. You're able to look at this from damage, from healers, everybody across the board, and this makes your life a lot easier when it comes to planning ramps. Some fights like Taros, for example, you can see some variety here and there of when players are breaking up, for example, their Rapture and their Evangelism, but then you can also see a lot of consistency that most of the players across the board are putting their Rapture and Evangelism together, and that's because they're covering specific windows in time and allowing other players on their healing team to be able to cover those other spots as well. It's also really good to be able to look at when you want to use Barrier. One of the encounters like Kurog, for example, you can see pretty much the most consistent areas for Barrier around like the 530 mark, because there's huge raid-wide damage and huge pressure going out onto everybody at those points. This is a wonderful way to be able to start preparing yourself in advance for that output and to make sure that you know those timings. As I mentioned previously, you are going to have a number of different builds and different ways that players are optimizing their damage, and that's why I also wanted to highlight WoW Analyzer. Because WoW Analyzer does a great job of breaking down specific parts of how your talents are working and what you're getting benefits from. When you want to know if your evangelism ramps are actually receiving full value, this is a Broodkeeper Diurna kill, where you can see the very first ramp, it has extended 20 atonements. But the second evangelism ramp has only extended 11. By the very nature of how Diurna works, you have to split up the raid, and so you can see, while on a fight like Taros, 11 atonements extended with evangelism would be really bad, on this fight, that's just how it works. That's just the expectation of how it works. And so this allows you to get context and also greater clarity on how your resources are working and in your favor and what is yielding you the most value. For example, you're able to see what is yielding atonement healing for you the most. When it comes to certain abilities like Penance and Halo, they sort of merge together some of the light and dark elements sometimes, but with Dark Reprimand, since it makes another ability, you're able to see not only is it 7% here, but also 12% there, and there's a huge emphasis on making sure that both your Penance and your Halo are hitting at the exact moments in time where there's the most damage. Same thing with Light's Wrath. Only casting it 6 or 8 times an encounter is resulting in a huge chunk of your overall atonement output. And so making sure that whenever the largest burst of damage is happening, that's when you're sticking your Light's Wrath. You're able to look at all of these things, plug in your logs, look at how your mana pool is doing over the course of the encounter, and get a great look into how your mana and how your resources are sort of working in your favor, as well as how frequently you're using some abilities. Whenever I'm learning how to use my Radiances properly in a progression encounter, a lot of times I'll hold on to my Radiance casts and not take extra advantage of them. But you also get into some fights like Broodkeeper, where you kind of have to sit on your hands a lot, and you have to wait for the next burst of damage to come out. And that's why you'll kind of see the same thing with the Lorgs page when it comes to a fight like Broodkeeper. You're able to start pulling up when players are using Radiance, and sometimes there's going to naturally be gaps, like you can see out of this rank foreparse right here, where some players are kind of just sitting on their hands a little bit. And you can see that just because they're sitting on those resources, they can still get a huge amount of output and still place really well in the encounter and still produce a lot of healing because their timings for their evangelism and their timings for their rapture are so precise. I know this video threw a crazy amount of different resources and different things at the player, so I wanted to sum it up with a pseudo TLDR. Dispriest is all about putting together large amounts of atonement at very precise windows of time to be able to reverse that incoming damage. By utilizing Rapture and Evangelism together, that's going to make up the brunt of your overall output. With a lot of the additional Radiance charges that you have in between your ramps, a lot of times it's best to make better use of those Radiance charges to heal in between Evangelism's cooldown, rather than single target apply atonements to spot heal as needed. Your focus is to prepare for specific moments in time, usually every minute and a half, rather than constantly be healing like a holy priest, rather than constantly be sort of like spot healing and looking out for incoming damage. Definitely flash heal or defensive penance somebody if they're about to die. Powered life's good for that too. But your priority is always going to be building up for a specific damage event and reversing that damage through the use of your resources. Discipline is great at that, but it's also very important to make sure that you're keeping a few fundamentals together. Using your shield on cooldown to maintain atonement on your tanks, maintaining Purge the Wicked, using Solace on cooldown, and taking advantage of extra resources like your Powered Radiances, which you can have more of and more frequently depending on how much mana you have at your disposal, how well you're using your Chilled Clarity potions to be able to reduce the mana cost of your ramps overall, and of course, how much healing you're able to produce from those to be able to get a bit more extra output in between your ramps. The primary focus is always going to be on perfecting those Rapture and Evangelism timings and making sure you're getting full raid-wide coverage whenever possible. Shadow Covenant, of course, is going to be used to be able to maximize your burst output. And so many builds are using Schism and Light's Wrath very early on for the first sort of punch for your output, and then following it up with your Shadow Covenant, since its small duration requires you fit many shadow spells into a very limited window in time. To be able to look over a lot of the other sequences, again, Warcraft Logs is a lovely resource. Lorgs.io is a great resource, as well as WoW Analyzer, to break down when damage is happening on each of the different encounters and to be able to set yourself up properly to be able to reverse that incoming damage. I know there's a lot of abilities that go on with the spec. I know it's a lot of information. Definitely check out the written guides as well for the different write-ups, as well as VODs, boss tips, and everything like that from Mythic Kills as well. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much for watching. I know this is a lot to get through. Hopefully we covered all those bases. And if I can make some shorter videos on more specific topics, let me know. Thank you for watching, guys. Hope you all enjoyed it, and I'll catch y'all next time.